Thank you very much for your kind remarks and for giving me the opportunity to come here and share my experiences of working not only in Southern Africa, but I think specifically in the context of Zimbabwe. I've been here in Washington for the past 4 months now. I'm on a 5-month fellowship where I'm interacting with colleagues from other parts of the world, just sharing ideas on how to advance democracy in the different contexts where we come from. I come from Zimbabwe, and I'm sure many of you in the room have heard or at least read about Zimbabwe. Speaking of big man politics that Joe was referring to, I think some of you might know Mr. Robert Mugabe, the president of the country, probably the oldest living president in modern day time. He turns 90 in a few weeks, but he's still holding on to political power. And he has indicated that he will be contesting the next election in 5 years. So that will be in 2018. Zimbabwe, I think, has been sort of the poster country of, how not to run a country. It's a country that experiences, a liberation struggle, gains independence in 1980, with a lot of promise, for an African country. Mugabe inherits a very good economy, if you like, with a very strong manufacturing base. I think in 1980, Zimbabwe ranked as, one of the countries with contribution to GDP from the manufacturing sector. I think it was ranking at the same level as countries like Germany. Very good soils, very good infrastructure, and a rich resource endowment with minerals and many other blessings. But a political elite then uses political power for personal and factional benefits. And we see the kind of challenges that we have seen. And in all of this, the military has taken a very prominent role in shaping political processes and economic processes in Zimbabwe. I think in general, if you look at Southern Africa, the idea of military coups and military regimes is not something that is very common, even if you go into the history. I mean, if you look at West Africa, there is a long history of military coups and military dictatorships in that part of the world, or part of the continent. But Southern Africa does not have that kind of tradition. But what we have seen in Zimbabwe, I think, is some kind of coup by stealth, if you like. The fact that we have a military regime which has become deeply entrenched, not only in political processes, but even in the public policy system of the country. They have become sort of a de facto, policy-making unit of the government, and I'll speak shortly to that. What we have also witnessed in Zimbabwe is an entrenchment of a culture of electoral violence, a culture of political violence in which, opponents have been targeted and have been brutalized, and some have even lost their lives simply because they have dared to oppose the regime of Mr. Mugabe. As I am speaking, we just came out of an election, July of 2013. The election marked the end of 4 years of a power-sharing government between the party that I represent, the Movement for Democratic Change, and the party of Mr. Mugabe, ZANU-PF. The government of national unity was born out of a negotiated political settlement under the Southern Africa Development Community, following a disputed election in 2008. This was a very violent election. The military launched a brutal attack on innocent civilians and punished people for having voted against Mr. Mugabe in the first round of the election in March 2008. The election that we've just come out of, again, was, a disputed election. The outcome has been disputed. Of course, SADC has given it, a clean bill of health and said it's a legitimate election. They stayed away from free and fair. I think they used the language peaceful and legitimate. But if you look at the irregularities that accompanied the election, you will realize that it's an election whose outcome will continue to present challenges for Zimbabwe as the search for a democratic breakthrough continues. Now, the militarization of state institutions is something that started, I think, around about 1999-2000, with the emergence of a very strong opposition to Mr. Mugabe. We begin to see serving and retired members of the military being deployed to head strategic institutions that are critical for retaining political power. So if you go to the public media, for instance, which is the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, you'll find that the head or the CEO of the public corporation is a military person. If you go to the Electoral Commission, which runs elections, you will realize that the person who's chairing or is heading that unit is a military person. If you go to the Grain Marketing Board, which is a public institution that sets policy on distribution of grain, it might sound very mundane, but grain is very important in terms of Zimbabwean politics and African politics, because it's used to gain political support. So if you go to the Grain Marketing Board, the person who's heading the Grain Marketing Board is someone with military credentials. If you go to the judiciary, you will realize that most of the judges who are sitting there are sort of, people with a liberation history. So some of you might say, well, that's normal. Even in the US, you have retired military people serving in civilian institutions. The difference is that these people have openly declared their support to one political party and said, because of the liberation struggle that we went through as a country, we are not going to have any other political party taking over the reins of the state. And that has been problematic in terms of Zimbabwe's search for a democratic breakthrough. You also see the militarization in the form of the granting of lucrative government contracts to companies that are headed by military people. If you go to, for instance, a company that is supplying daily, rations to the prison services, you realize that it's a company that belongs to the military chiefs or the military elite. If you go to the mining sector, for instance, we've just 5-6 years ago, we discovered diamonds in the eastern part of the country, and it's a very lucrative business that a lot of Chinese companies have gone into, and then they have been granted mining concessions. But if you look at the people that have gone into joint ventures with these Chinese mining companies, they are companies that are headed by the military. In some instances, even the military is in there as an institution and not just as the military elites. And what we have seen with the military control of the natural resources, in particular the diamonds, is that there's been rampant corruption, illicit sales of the diamonds. The proceeds that have come from the sales of the diamonds have not gone into treasury, have not gone into the fiscus. And as a result, you have an economy which is, almost off the rails. Unemployment is currently at 80%. Job losses, just in the last quarter of 2012, close to 10,000 Zimbabweans lost their jobs. And it looks like as we move along in the first quarter of the year, more companies are going to be closing because of viability challenges. But this is a country which is mining diamonds, and these diamonds are being sold illicitly. If you go to India today, I think there's a state or province called Surat, and it's a diamond cutting city. They have just reported that the price of diamonds there have gone down because of an oversupply from Zimbabwe. But you have a situation where the Minister of Finance in the country has failed to even, pronounce a budget to the country because he's saying there's no money. Now you begin to see how control of natural resources by the military elites has undermined democratic processes in the country. And yet, some of these proceeds have been deployed to strategic institutions. So if you go to the military itself, you realize that it's very functional in terms of, access to resources and, being able to keep the military elites satisfied. They have been able to do that. They have recently constructed an elite training college for the military at a cost of $100 million. This has been done by the Chinese, of course, with money that is coming out of the money that's coming out of the diamonds. So, something that I call the resource curse or the diamond curse, in terms of undermining a transition to democracy in Zimbabwe. As we reflect on possibilities going forward and what different actors can do, I think that, as I said earlier on, Mr. Mugabe is 90, and he's not going to be there forever. There are possibilities that there might be some changes within his own political party, but those changes might not necessarily mean changes in terms of the national politics. I think that if we have the factions that are sort of fighting for control of the party post-Mugabe taking over, we may see an entrenchment of the military in politics and economics and other aspects of Zimbabwean life. There is also the possibility of maybe a democratic breakthrough in terms of credible elections happening in 2018. But I think the work to prepare for that has to start now, and Zimbabwean civil society has a role to play. International actors, including the US government, have a role to play. You will know that currently the regime of Mr. Mugabe is under US and EU sanctions, and other Western governments have imposed sanctions, or at least certain restrictions on the political elite. Now there are questions on whether that has been effective in terms of isolating this regime. I argue that the sanctions have not been very smart in terms of the targeting, number one, number two, in the sense that when you impose sanctions on a government, the hope is that you are going to create sufficient domestic pressure for the regime to be pushed out of power. But what we have had in Zimbabwe is you impose restrictions on the political regime, but at the same time, humanitarian support that's going into the country. It's in the billions, and it's propping up this regime. They support to social services, they support to infrastructure, they support to nutrition and all these things. So I think that there's been a mismatch in terms of the intentions of some of these restrictions and the actual actions on the ground. I think in terms of other opportunities, obviously, the demographic structure of the country is shifting. This generation of the big men, the Mugabes and his inner circle, they are old, and they will soon, they will soon exit the political stage. But the question is, how do we get rid of this political culture? Because even the younger generations that are, coming up in the same system, are sort of going to be replicating the actions of their seniors. So the question is, what can be done in terms of making sure that the citizens are empowered, so that they can, determine their own future. So those are some of the issues I think that those who care about the future of Zimbabwe have to be grappling with. I think I'll stop now, and then I can answer some questions later on.